Penguin Random House Audio presents John Hancock, First to Sign, First to Invest in America's Independence, by Willard Sterne Randall. Read for you by Steve Hendrickson. For Nancy. Prologue. In the September 1930 issue of Harper's Monthly Magazine, New England historian James Truslow Adams published an unprecedented attack on John Hancock, the founding father whose flamboyant autograph on the Declaration of Independence has become synonymous with a signature. Entitling his article Portrait of an Empty Barrel, Adams excoriated Hancock, the Boston businessman who financed, organized, and helped to lead Massachusetts throughout the American Revolutionary era. Adams, a retired investment banker and one-time diplomat who had turned to writing history, dismissed Hancock's 3 decades as an unpaid public servant who had risen through the ranks of colonial politics from Boston selectman to 3-term president of the Continental Congress, at the time the equivalent to President of the United States. Ridiculing Hancock, Adams wrote, "His chief resources were his money and his gout, the first always used to gain popularity, and the second to prevent his losing it." Adams was undoubtedly influenced by the 1913 publication of economic historian Charles A. Beard's controversial book, An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution. Professor Beard contended that economic forces underlay the movement for the formation and adoption of the federal Constitution, and determined its most important provisions. The founder of the revisionist progressive school of American history, Beard asserted that all of the merchants, moneylenders, security holders, manufacturers, shippers, capitalists, financiers, and their professional associates supported the Constitution. To Adams, Hancock fitted all of these parameters. 2 years after his Harper's critique, Adams, as editor of the multi-volume Dictionary of American Biography, tasked himself with writing Hancock's biographical entry. He denounced Hancock as shallow and vainglorious, and easily manipulated. In his own time, as early as 1809, fellow founding father John Adams lamented that Hancock had been virtually buried in oblivion, even in Boston where, as head of the House of Hancock, one of colonial America's preeminent mercantile firms, he had been central to commerce and politics. There had been little effort to preserve his legacy. The Hancock family mansion atop Beacon Hill was torn down in 1863, when neither the city nor the state would maintain it. In 1817, John Adams, once a caustic critic of his fellow founder, wrote to William Tudor, "I am not writing the life of Mr. Hancock. His biography would fill as many volumes as John Marshall's Washington, and be quite as instructive and entertaining. But if statues, obelisks, pyramids, or divine honors were ever merited, John Hancock deserved these from the town of Boston and the United States." Not until 1876, the centennial of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, was there even so much as a plaque commemorating Hancock in Boston. And another 2 decades would pass before, in 1898, more than a century after Hancock died and was buried in what was essentially an unmarked grave, Massachusetts erected a modest memorial column in the Granary Burying Ground just off Boston Common. Historian Alfred Young explains that Massachusetts' new elite was not comfortable with a rich man who pledged his fortune in the cause of revolution. By the time of James Truslow Adams' 1930 critique, only one biography of Hancock had appeared. One possible explanation: while Hancock had authored innumerable state papers, he apparently left no trove of personal papers, in contrast to more prolific founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and fellow Bostonian John Adams. Moreover, Hancock had no descendants who could periodically commemorate his contributions. James Truslow Adams' disparaging appraisal of Hancock began at once to influence the verdicts of future generations of chroniclers. Immediately after Adams's scathing profile of Hancock in the Dictionary of American Biography, Samuel Eliot Morison, Harvard's distinguished official historian, devoted fully 6 pages of his 1936 classic 3 Centuries of Harvard to Hancock's troubled relations with the college as its treasurer during the Revolution and as ex officio president of its senior governing board. Following suit, in 1945, Harvard Business School economic historian W.T. Baxter published The House of Hancock. After itemizing and praising the accomplishments of John's uncle Thomas, Baxter concluded his profile of Hancock with words closely paraphrasing Adams, calling him the empty barrel. As historian Donald Proctor points out, of the scant handful of Hancock biographies, all have largely relied on the voluminous writings of the signer's political opponents. But John Hancock was far more than a citizen of Massachusetts. From the Stamp Act crisis of 1765 to the outbreak of the Revolutionary War 10 years later, he emerged as a prominent figure in protests against increasing imperial controls. For the next 15 years, Hancock was a major shaper of American political development. He can be properly appreciated only through an attempt at understanding the political life and times of which he was a part, a task made more difficult by the fact that many of Hancock's activities were shrouded in secrecy by the very nature of his business, others because they verged on treason. A deeper dive into archives that have been recently digitalized and into the papers of other better-known founders has now made it possible to reconstruct John Hancock's contributions and his controversies. In the process, much of the mythology created during the centuries since James Truslow Adams' vituperative appraisal can be peeled away. For example, John Adams insisted in his 1809 memoir that Hancock had expected to be selected as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Adams described a red-faced Hancock's reaction when, instead, he nominated George Washington. This scene has never been corroborated by any other delegate to the Second Continental Congress. Adams' claim came a quarter-century after the supposed event, during which time Hancock and Adams had fallen out over bitter post-Revolutionary Party politics. Adams's autobiography was also published after Hancock's death, denying him the opportunity to refute it. This book will show how John Hancock and George Washington worked in tandem through 3 terms of the incoherent and ultimately unworkable Continental Congress to resolve the numerous political and logistical problems of supporting and supplying the Continental Army, together struggling to keep the Revolution alive. Incidentally, Hancock named his only short-lived son John George Washington Hancock. John Hancock will explore Hancock's 30-year relationship with the other founding fathers as they labored together to give birth to the United States of America. Chapter 1. The Known World. Born in Braintree, Massachusetts, into a family of Puritan clergy, John Hancock seemed destined to be the third of his name to become a parson in a small town. His grandfather, John Hancock I, attended Harvard College on a scholarship. Son of a shoemaker, he had somehow taught himself enough Greek and Latin to pass the written and oral examinations required for admission. Matriculating with the class of 1689, he was accorded a class ranking that indicated his social standing, 13th of 14. After he graduated with a bachelor's degree, it took Hancock I 10 years of guest preaching before he found a congregation, in what became Lexington, that liked what he said enough to offer him a permanent pastorate. He filled the Lexington pulpit and its meeting house for 54 years, becoming known as the Bishop for his imperious manner. John Hancock I married the daughter of a neighboring clergyman. They had 5 children, including 2 daughters, who also married parsons, and 3 sons, the oldest inheriting his father's name, but not his imperious disposition. Asked the proper duties of the church elders, The bishop answered that there were only two, saddling his horse and holding his bridle.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?